right? Take this to be a premise and then see if the conclusion follows. Right, we could do that. I think for this particular question, it doesn't matter too much. What really matters is to just recognize that this is a conditional conclusion to begin with. If you recognize that, I think you have a much better chance of sidestepping using current technology, it would be possible for steel manufacturing plants to feed the heat they produce into these generators in such a way that these generators could convert at least some of that heat into electricity. It's so attractive because, man, it's so weak, right? Like, I bet you, well, my attention, I bet your attention is also drawn to this phrase. Oh yeah, they shouldn't they? Isn't it necessary that they are able to convert at least some of the heat into electricity? I mean, imagine if they couldn't convert any of the heat. Wouldn't that be devastating for the argument? Right? It's just so weakly stated. And what it's doing, what the test writers are doing, is they know that a certain percentage of students will use these rules of thumb, right? Like these heuristics, these things that are like mostly right, okay, approximately right. And the rule of thumb here is that when you do a necessary assumption, you pick the weak sounding answer. That's the rule of thumb. And like I said, it'll deliver like, I don't know, 80% of the time, 70% of the time. But the test writers know this. And right here in answer choice B, they're telling us they know this. And they're punishing people who use uncritically that rule of thumb. Okay, and that's the key phrase is keyword is uncritically. Rules of thumb are useful. Heuristics are super useful. They're time savers, but you do have to know their limitations. Here, you can't just be like, oh, it says at least some, so therefore it must be right. No, no, this is not necessary. Why not? Because the argument is explicitly stating a conditional conclusion. The engineer is saying, listen, imagine we're in a hypothetical world where steel manufacturing plants could feed the heat they produce into these generators. My conclusion is constrained to that world. With that perspective in mind, is this necessary? Must it be possible using current technology to do this? No, it is not necessary. I don't care if our current technology can or cannot do this, because the argument exists in some hypothetical world where you could do this. Okay, so that's why B is not necessary, in spite of the fact you can be as weak as you want.
Hello, I'm studying for the LSAT. Hola. So I'm on my computer watching a video doing some practice problems right now. So you can sit down and study with me if you'd like. Hi, Faith. Right now I'm studying for the LSAT on my computer. So you can keep the comments coming, guys. But since I am studying, I won't be able to respond until I'm finished studying. Hi, Jalen. Hi, Jaden. Welcome. Hi, Kay.
This has nothing to do with why this is the wrong answer. Okay, so remember that.
Also, I use 7 Sage LSAT for anyone who's planning to study for the LSAT soon. This is a great resource that I found to use. Hi, James. Hi, Ryan. Welcome.
But one other
Hi,
strategy,
Lily.
or one other, sorry, not strategy, one other drill, and it's something that I want you to build a habit of if you haven't already, is with these really attractive answers, edit the stimulus, right? Edit the stimulus or edit the answer, one of the two, or both, to make B right. And here, I want you to edit the stimulus to make B right, because there is some version of the argument that looks a lot like this argument, but obviously different in crucial ways, but looks a lot like this argument, where B would be the correct answer, would be a necessary assumption. Okay, so think about that. It's actually not a lot of editing at all. You keep the first two sentences the same. You just got to change the conclusion. Make it not a conditional conclusion. Say something like, oh, by the way, steel manufacturing, they don't use these generators. Therefore, they're missing out on an opportunity to reduce their electricity bills, right? Like if you say the conclusion like that, therefore, you are present tense, right? You're missing out on an opportunity to reduce, to save money or whatever, then B becomes absolutely necessary. You have to assume that using current technology, it's at least possible to convert some of the. Now this becomes a strength of the answer, right? As opposed to something irrelevant to the answer because it was rendered irrelevant by this phrase. Okay, so um, that's a that's like a way to highlight how B is in the right answer. Okay, so I mentioned that there's two hurdles here. What we just talked about, that's probably the biggest hurdle that trips up most students, but the other one is a complex support structure. Okay, let's say we employ the technique of kicking it up and we kick this up into the premise set, right? So, well, then there's some support structure going from here to here. If steel manager could feed the heat into generators, there's some support that they would greatly reduce electric bills. This is pretty strong, right? Like, presumably you're not doing it now. And if you were doing it, if you were using these generators, it will be internal sources of electricity generation. So, yeah.
Okay, hold on. So practice problem now because I got that question right. All right, guys. So for the new people who joined, hi Ax, hi Patricia, welcome everyone. I'm studying for the LSAT right now on my computer. So I'm watching some videos, doing some practice problems. So unfortunately, won't be able to respond to your comments until after I'm finished studying. But brief intermission to just tell the new people what I'm doing. So if you want to see me studying, feel free to stay, watch me study, and listen to the video. Also, I use 7 Sage LSAT, and I think it's a great resource to use if you're studying for the LSAT. So right now I'm going to do a practice problem, so it's going to be quiet for a little bit. Following is an assumption required by the argument. When teaching art students about the use of color, teachers should use colored paper rather than print in their demonstrations. Colored paper is preferable teaching art students about the use of color, teachers should okay. Hmm. Oh, that was surprising. I got that right. Lord. Okay, we'll rewrite that question now. And so I can review it later. That was a hard question.
Okay, let's take a look at how you did on this question. Question 7, assumption required. Now, structurally, the argument opens with a prescriptive conclusion in favor of using one method over another method in the service of achieving some goal. Okay, so it tries to justify this prescriptive conclusion with purely descriptive premises, premises that describe the similarities and differences between these two different approaches. Okay, that's the main thrust of the argument. Now, what's missing here is that these differences described are relevant to this prescription, or more precisely, that they help achieve this goal. Okay, that's the missing bridge. We need an assumption that carries us from these descriptive premises to a prescriptive conclusion. Right? The way to do that here, I mean, we've seen this a lot in PSA where they just say, oh, if such and such is true, then such and such should be the case. That's a descriptive to prescriptive bridge. That's not the only way to build a descriptive to prescriptive bridge. In a situation like this, where you're prescribing something in the service of a goal, another way to do it is just to say that this thing that you're prescribing helps to achieve that goal. Okay, so if you had trouble with this question, maybe with that kind of bird's eye view, try it again. All right, but let's dive in. So we have a prescriptive conclusion, like I said, when teaching our students about the use of color. So this is the goal, right? This is your goal. Here's the prescription. Teachers should use color paper. This is the preferred method rather than this other method. Why, right? Why? You have to justify this. There's the conclusion, and we're going to get premises here. And note the transition that it's all description. Okay, it's all description. Look at color paper is preferable. Why? Because it readily permits a repeated use of exactly the same color in different compositions, which allow for a precise comparison of that color's impact in varying contexts. With paint, however, it's difficult to mix the same color twice, and the varying textures can interfere with the pure effect of color itself. See, notice that this is all descriptive language. It permits repeated use of the same color, and that allows for a precise comparison of the colors in high varying contexts. Okay, so these are all true things. Paint, it is difficult. It's just true. It's difficult, right? The varying texture does interfere with the pure effect, right? These are just true things. Now, the question is, how do these differences relate to teaching students about the use of color? The argument strongly baits us to supply that missing descriptive prescriptive bridge. And I think it's effective. Okay, I think it's effective. I think we all look at this and we're like, well, of course we want precise comparison of the color's impact. Well, of course, interfering with the pure effect of color itself is not good for teaching students. Hold on a second. How do you know that? It's not stated on the page. Is this a good thing? I mean, all I know right now is that this is a point of difference between color paper and paint. All I know right now is that this is a point of difference between color paper and paint. Where does it say that this point of difference counsels in favor of color paper? Where does it say that this point of difference counsels against the use of paint? That's what's missing. And that's what makes D absolutely necessary. Observing impacts of color across varying contexts, look at this, helps students to learn about the use of color. Here, we're making explicit that this difference, right? This difference that's been described between color paper and paint, right? The difference that manifests in the observation and impact of color across varying contexts. Right here with paint, it interferes. Here with color paper, it helps to do that. Okay, that's a point of difference. Is that a relevant point of difference? D says absolutely, because it helps students um, learn about the use of color. Yeah, that has to be true. If this were false, if this were irrelevant to helping students learn about the use of color, well, then these descriptive premises become irrelevant. This point of difference becomes irrelevant. I don't know why I should prefer color paper to paint. Okay, that's why D is correct. Now, I think in isolation, this is not that challenging, right? Like, I'm sure you follow that explanation. I'm sure you're like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. What makes this challenging, once again, is the presence of the wrong answers. We'll start with A, which says two pieces of paper of exactly the same color will have the same effect in a given context, even if they are of different textures. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, A is feinting to strengthen, meaning it's pretending to strengthen the argument, when in reality, it doesn't. Because all A tells us is that two pieces of paper of exactly the same color will have the same effect in a given context, even if the texture is different. One is smooth, one is rough, doesn't matter. What does that have to do with argument? Well, if this is true, then this would just be yet another point of differentiation between color paper and paint. Right? Because we know that for paint, texture does interfere. Right here, A is telling, oh, you know what, with paper, it doesn't interfere. Okay, what then? Nothing. We already had plenty of points of difference between color paper and paint. What was missing was for us to connect that point of differentiation to the goal we're trying to achieve. We don't need to keep making more points of differentiation. Oh, paper is also different from paint in this respect. Oh, you know what? Paper is also different from paint in this respect. And look, A doesn't even tell us if this point of differentiation matters. If you liked A, if A was attractive, it's because you're once again supplying that missing assumption that having the same effect, irrespective of different textures, is a desirable quality, right? It's a desirable quality in the sense that it will help students learn about the use of color. You can't do that. You can't do that with answer choice. I mean, that was a problem with the argument. We couldn't do that. Like the precise comparison interfering with the pure effect. We couldn't say that these are good thing or good and bad things. We needed the answer choice to state that assumption for us. So A is writing on that same psychological tendency that made us overlook the correct answer in the first place. A rides on that same psychological tendency to make us think that this is correct. Now, if we assume, if we state having the same effect in a given context, even of different, you know, helps, right, students learn about the use of, well, then great. A is a very powerful, strengthening answer. It still wouldn't be necessary, right? Still wouldn't be necessary, but it would be, it would be strengthening. Okay. Now, what about B? A slight difference in the color of two pieces of paper is more difficult to notice than a slight difference in the color of two samples of paint. What's happening here? The same thing that happened in A. B is once again simply reporting another point of difference. You know what else is different between paper, color paper, and paint? This thing is different. I'm not even going to get into the details because it doesn't matter. Because I don't know if this brand new point of differentiation is relevant. Does it help?
All right, guys, good morning. For those of you who are still here, thank you for staying here with me. So, right now, I'm studying for the LSAT, as the title said. Right now, so I'm using Seven Sage, and Seven Sage is basically a platform where there's practice questions. So, I just answered a practice question and I got it right. Surprised myself because that was a challenging question. So, I like to write those challenging questions down. And now, while I'm writing the question down, I'm listening to the video explanation on how to find the correct answer. Yeah, so I'm basically reviewing questions for the LSAP. So definitely keep your comments coming. Thank you so much for the compliments. Thank you, Shy. You're pretty as well. Ax, I did see your comment. I'm glad you fixed your prosthetic leg. But once I'm finished reviewing, I will definitely answer your questions and speak to you guys. You can decide what I'm gonna eat for breakfast. If you want to do that, I have my options are cereal and milk, or I can make like a turkey bacon and egg sandwich. So what should I eat for breakfast? Drop it in the comment section, and then you guys can choose for me. And when I'm done, I'll make that. But It's going to be quiet again. I'm not really going to be speaking to you right now because I am studying, but definitely drop what I should have for breakfast and I'll make it. So my options once again are cereal and milk or turkey bacon and an egg sandwich. But back to studying, guys.
Or does it hurt students to learn about the use of color? It doesn't say. Well, then I don't care. C says changing light conditions have less of an effect on the parent color piece of paper than the color of paint. Right? What's going on here? I think you get it, right? It's the same thing as A and B, just pointing out another difference. But is this a difference that helps students learn about the use of color or not? No idea. Hence, irrelevant. And finally, E says it's important that our students understand how the effect of using colored paper in various compositions differ from those of using paint in those compositions. So E is saying it is important for our students to know how paper versus paint differ in this regard. Okay, yeah, irrelevant, right? Irrelevant, because look at what the argument is trying to do. It sets out a very narrow goal. It's saying if you're trying to teach our students about the use of color, then do this rather than this, right? Use this rather than this. Why? Because of these things. E isn't interested in having that conversation. He's like, oh, you're talking about teaching our students. Well, let me tell you what's important when you teach our students. Here's one thing that's important that you might not have thought about. Okay, sure, right? Yeah, I'm sure this is important for teaching our students. And the argument didn't think about this. But so what? Who cares? The argument is what it is. It has a premise, or more than one premise actually. It's got its conclusion, hence it has a support structure, and our job is to find the necessary assumption that hides within the support structure. It's not to zoom out and talk about some tangentially, adjacently related thing.
Which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain why the astronomers' estimate of the star's distance from Earth help resolve the earlier conflict between the ages of the stars and the age of the universe? Astronomer, earlier estimates of the distance. What? Astronomer, earlier estimates of the distance of certain stars would mean that these stars are about 1 billion years older than so, impossible scenario. Okay. Oh, okay, so you initially believed that they were a certain distance from Earth. Now you believe they're farther than they actually are, okay? And the farther away the stars are, the greater their intricate. So the farther they are, the brighter they are, okay? Age of the universe, okay? Okay. Older the stars, the more bright the stars are, is what you're saying, not the younger, okay? That's wrong. Okay, this might be a good option. Let's see what else they have. Let's do blind movie right now. Farther away the stars are, the greater. Farther away the redder, as I said. Okay. Let's see. A and D are good. Can you test me for the answer? Which one to click? Gotta go to best. Yeah, you can't get everything right.
Okay, let's take a look at how you did on this question. First, I hope you notice that this is an RRE question. This is not a necessary assumption question. We're asked to help to explain, right? Help to explain something. But actually, upon closer inspection, what is it that we're asked to explain? Why this, right? Why this? And what is this? This is just the conclusion. You see the conclusion indicator. So, in other words, we're being asked to explain why this is the conclusion, which means we're asked to explain why this follows from this. And that's a good question because as it stands, there's a big fat question mark over here. I'm not sure what's happening. How is it that these claims amount to this conclusion? And the reason why I don't understand is because the argument makes a huge assumption. It makes a huge assumption. So if we find the assumption, we have helped to explain why the conclusion follows from the premise. So in this particular question, RRE and assumption just collapse into each other. They're just doing the same thing. Okay, so now, of course, this doesn't always happen, right? In fact, most RRE questions aren't like this because most RRE questions don't have an argument baked into them, right? They just give you a phenomenon, and the phenomena just seem kind of confusing and, sometimes contradictory, sometimes irreconcilable, and then we're just supposed to find a hypothesis that explains it. But here, as it happens, we're kind of just doing an assumption question, right? Okay, so now there is a lot that's difficult about this question. One of the things that's difficult just is right here in the context where the astronomer tells us that earlier estimates of distance of certain stars from Earth would mean that these stars are about 1 billion years older than the universe itself, which is impossible, right? Like, this is just an impossible scenario. Okay, so what do we do? How do we reconcile this scenario? Well, there are lots of ways to do it. One way is just say that, you know what, the universe is older than we thought, right? The universe is older. Another way is to say that stars are younger than we thought, right? Because right now it just doesn't make any sense. The stars can't be 1 billion years older than the universe. So either the universe is older or the stars are younger. Okay, that is a crucial realization. That's a crucial realization because without that realization, you're not. It's not clear how you're going to interpret this. Help to resolve the earlier conflict between the ages of these stars and the age of the universe. But with that interpretation, now we have a path to figuring out what this astronomer is talking about. Okay, so now let's keep reading. Right, my estimate of the distance indicates that the stars are much farther away than previous thought. Okay, so earlier estimates of the star, right? So this is Earth, right? This is the star. Earlier estimate thinks that, oh, it's over here. Now what? Now we think that the star is like, way farther out. Okay, let's keep going. And the farther away the stars are, right? The farther away, the greater their intrinsic brightness must be, given their appearance to us on Earth. Okay. See, this is also really tough to understand. There's this there's this relationship between three entities, and I do want to talk about that. But before I do, I'm wondering if you can just approach this formally, because you do have a shot at getting this right. If you thought about what this means, okay, if you thought about what this means and you realize that there was an inference to mine out, which is that either the universe is older or the stars are younger. Because if you realize that, then you might have a chance of approaching this just kind of formally. Meaning, look, they told us distance is greater now, which means intrinsic brightness is higher now, right? These stars are now intrinsically brighter. And so if you're going to say that the new estimates of distance resolve the earlier conflict, you just have to say that the greater the intrinsic brightness, the what? The younger the star. That resolves the conflict. And that's why C is the correct answer. The brighter a star, the younger it is. Now, I mentioned that I want to go back to this idea because it is well, it's kind of a tough idea to understand, I think. You have this concept called distance, right? Distance meaning distance from observer. Okay, how far something is from the observer. And then you have this other idea called the apparent brightness. And then you have this other idea called the intrinsic brightness. These are all different ideas. Distance is probably the easiest to understand, just how far you are from something, right? Think about an airplane. An airplane's not that far from us in comparison to a star. A star is a lot farther away, okay? Now think about apparent brightness. Apparent brightness is just how bright something appears to us. That's a different concept from intrinsic brightness. Okay, intrinsic brightness is how actually bright an object is. For example, candlelight is not as intrinsically bright as an airplane light, which is not as intrinsically bright as a star. Okay, but all three can have the same apparent brightness if you what? If you mess around with distance, right? I mean, you take that star, which is super, super, super bright, and you just increase the distance by a lot. You just throw it at the end of the universe. You know how bright that super bright star, intrinsically super bright star, will appear to us? Not bright at all. In fact, we probably can't even see it. Right? So a mere candle flame will appear brighter than that star because the candle flame is a lot closer to us. Okay, and you can think about an airplane as sort of a in between kind of thing. But you see, so all three of these concepts are related to each other. So that's what the astronomer is talking about here when he says, the distance, right? You see what changed here with the distance. We used to think it was here like this. So the apparent brightness, of course, didn't change. This is the thing that stayed fixed. We're still standing on the surface. We're still looking at the star. It still looks the same, right? It's not like all of a sudden the star looks brighter, then something happened to the star, right? So the apparent brightness didn't change. But if the distance changed, right, if there's change in this distance, which the astronomer said that you push the star farther out, which means what must be true about this? It must be intrinsically brighter. Otherwise, how can it look the same? That's the logic of this argument. And, like I said, that's just these three concepts, right? There's still another key concept that's missing, which is the age. What does the intrinsic brightness have to say about the age of the star? Well, C tells us the brighter the star is, the younger it is. And that's how this gets resolved. Okay, so that's why this question is, I think conceptually this question is very challenging. And look what he did in answer choice D, which is so devious. They put in something here, how bright a celestial object appears, right? The apparent brightness, this concept here, depends on how far away, depends on the distance. I mean, of course it does. Right? We talked about that already. Of course it does. And in fact, that was already implicit in here because this is one way to talk about it. This is another way to talk about it. You're just talking about the same thing. Okay, this is the farther away the stars is, that's the distance. You're talking about the greater the intrinsic given their appearance, right? The farther away, well, the brighter it must be given how it appears to us in terms of brightness. And from a different perspective, you're just saying, well, The apparent brightness depends on the distance. Yeah. You see, that's why D is not the right answer, because it's redundant. We already established this relationship in this premise. I mean, you're kind of just approaching it from a different angle. Right? But even with this being true, you see what's crucially missing in answer choice D is any relation to the concept of age. With this being true, you can't count on C because, right, I mean, they're separate answers. Just D alone doesn't patch up the assumption hole. Right? It doesn't help explain why, because we still don't know how any of this relates to age. Okay, so now we have three answers left. The stars are the oldest objects yet discovered in the universe. This is not relevant because we're not trying to do a comparison of, what are the oldest objects in the universe? Is it stars or is there something older than stars? Who cares, right? Because, like we said, all we care about is that these particular stars these certain stars that we're talking about. Yeah, now that we know that their intrinsic brightness is greater, how does that resolve the conflict between the earlier estimates of age and the age of, it has nothing to do with what. We just need to say that these stars, because they're brighter, they're younger. Okay, and B is quite similar. B says the younger the universe, the more bright stars it has. But it's not like, okay, so B is saying you take a young universe, you take an old universe. Which one has brighter stars, more brighter stars? The younger ones. Okay, so as the universe gets older and older and older, what happens? Its bright stars start to fade. You have fewer and fewer bright stars. Fine, but again, what does that have to do with this? You see what I mean? Like once you identify what assumption is actually missing, I think I mean, especially E, becomes very much, very ridiculously irrelevant. Like new telescopes allow astronomers to see a greater number of distant stars. I mean, come on. At least A and B kind of made a half-assed attempt to be relevant. E is not even trying.
So, guys, I'm going to do another topic because necessary assumptions are not my strong suit. And I'm getting some right, most of them wrong, and take a break and come back to it later. But for now, let's go on to flaws or deductive weakening questions. So, yeah.
I want to ease our way into flaw questions by looking at a question type that we should already be familiar with. This question that read most seriously undermines the reasoning, which means we are looking at a weakened question. Now, I want to look at weakening questions as an entree into flaw questions because the two question types share a lot of similarities. Okay, so I'll talk about what those are more in depth later, but the first one I want to flag is just the kind of logic you're going to deal with the stimulus. Recall from weaken, strengthen, evaluate, we dealt with causal logic a lot. It wasn't the exclusive kind of logic, but it showed up a ton in weaken, strengthen, evaluate questions. And similarly with flaw questions, you're going to have to deal with a lot of causal logic. Okay, so let's take a look here at the stimulus. First sentence says kennel club members who frequently discipline their dogs. What about them? They report higher incidence of misbehavior comparative than members who rarely or never discipline dogs. So I know it's been a while, but dust off that causation logic hat and put it on And tell me, using the terminology and framework of causal logic, what did we just read here? Okay, in general terms, what did we just read? We read a phenomenon, right? It's a description of phenomenon, but what kind of phenomenon is it? It's a correlation, right? It's a correlation. We now know that there is some positive correlation between what, right? Between what? Discipline on the one hand, right? And misbehavior on the other hand, right? Positive correlation, meaning these two things move together. More discipline, more misbehavior, right? More misbehavior, more discipline. They move together. Less discipline, less misbehavior. Less misbehavior, less discipline. That's positive correlation. They move in the same direction. Okay, so now I hid from you one last final sentence in this stimulus. You can probably already guess what it is, but what typically happens when we're presented with a correlation phenomenon? Typically, in weakening questions, we get a conclusion that attempts to explain this particular phenomenon. Right, the conclusion is tells some sort of causal story, right? It's a hypothesis, but we don't need to do that, right? Let's review. Let's think back to our core lessons in logic. What are the four possible explanations, right? What are the four explanations that tend to show up on the test, when we encounter this? We have A correlated with B. Well, hypothesis one is A causes B, right? That's how you explain this correlation. I know why it's correlated. It's because this learning causes misbehavior. Second one, B causes A. Oh, I can tell you a different story of why this is correlated. Dogs who misbehave spur their owners to discipline them. That one kind of coheres with our common sense. Right. Whereas that first one, A causes B, maybe you need to dig a little deeper. How can discipline cause misbehavior? Well, maybe a potential causal mechanism is, and here I'm just making stuff up, maybe dogs don't like to be disciplined, right? Like a dog gets disciplined, it starts to resent the owner, and that resentment shows up in more misbehavior. Okay, so that's the canine resentment theory, right, or hypothesis. I don't want to be not too pompous there. Canine resentment hypothesis, or hypothesis number one. Number two, pretty straightforward. Misbehavior causes, causes the owners to discipline. What's hypothesis three? Do you remember? It's some third thing that causes both the misbehavior and the discipline, right? So the story here would go something like, I can tell you why these two things are correlated. It's not that this causes that or this causes that. They're correlated because they share some common cause. Now here, I mean, if you can't think of a good story to tell, just go with a bad story, right? Because at least a bad story will capture the logic. So maybe what is the third thing that possibly could be causing, right? Could be causing both of this. I don't know. Maybe there's a ghost living in the house, right? And this is a ghost of strife, and it manifests in the dog acting out. Right, this is what the ghost of strife does. It possesses the dog and makes him act out. Right, and the ghost of strife possesses the owner and makes the owner discipline the dog. Right, so it's not that these two things cause each other. No, it's the ghost that's causing owners to behave this way. It's the ghost that's causing dogs to behave this way, and hence that's why we see the correlation. Right, so that's a pretty terrible hypothesis, you know. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if you can't think of one, like a realistic one, think of a fantastical one, right? So maybe a more realistic one might be that, maybe it's the ignorant owners hypothesis, right? So the owners are ignorant, right? They just don't know how to have a dog, and that's the cause of the dogs misbehaving because these ignorant owners maybe are not giving the dogs enough psychological or physical stimulation.
Local residents' argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that local resident, and overabundance, overabundance of algae must be harmful to smaller fish in the pond. Too much algae harmful to smaller fish in the pond. During the 15 or so years that I have lived here, the few times that I have seen large numbers of dead small fish wash ashore in the late summer coincide exactly with the time that I have noticed abundantly large amount of algae in the water. So they're saying when you see a lot of fish, you see a lot of dead fish, there's also a lot of algae in the water. Okay. Algae, dead fish. A lot. Late summer. Okay, let's see. Person, we're looking for a weakness, assumptions, anticipation, sensitivity effects, authors. Review. Yep. Reason in the argument above is most flawed. It's most flawed and reason argument is most flawed. The proportion of fat calories in the diets of people who read the nutrition labels on food products is significantly lower than it is in the diets of people who do not read nutritional labels. This shows that reading these labels promote healthy dietary behavior. Again, for calls from a correlation. A correlation doesn't give a correlation. Is this answer to this problem?
Okay, let's take a look at how you did on this question. Once again, starting with the question stem, the reasoning and argument above is flawed in that the argument, and just like the last question, see, each of these answers starts with a verb. That's because we're asked to describe what the argument has done. Right? Has it confused something? Has it taken something for granted? Has it drawn a conclusion about something? what the argument has done that makes its reasoning flawed. Let's turn to the stimulus. It says the proportion of fat calories in the diets of people who read nutritional labels on food products. This is dense grammar. We're talking about people who, like, not everybody reads nutritional labels on food products, but some people do. So for the people who do turn the product around, like, oh, how much fat, how much sugar are for those people, well, what about them? Well, the proportion of fat calories in their diets that is significantly lower than it is in diets of people who don't read labels. Right, another comparative claim. People who read the labels on the one hand, people who don't read the labels on the other hand. For the people who do, proportionally, they consume less fat calories. Okay, so here comes the conclusion. This shows that reading labels promotes healthful dietary behavior. Causal verb. Causal verb. Once again, we have phenomenon, hypothesis. Right, just like the two previous questions, premise, conclusion, phenomenon, hypothesis, and the phenomenon here is a correlation, right? Positive correlation between people who read these nutritional labels and having lower fat calories. Okay, so if you read the labels, you have less fat calories. If you don't read the labels, you have more fat calories. Now, what could explain this phenomenon, right? What could explain why people who read have lower, people who don't have higher? One explanation is A causes B. The fact that you read these labels is what what causes you to have lower fat calories. Now, if you want, to zoom in and talk about like the mechanism, this is pretty commonsensical, right? Maybe you turn over some processed food, right? You look at the label, you're like, whoa, okay, I didn't know it had like 3,000% of my daily saturated fat in this. So maybe I'll put this back, right? Maybe I'll go for the carrot instead. You know what I mean? So that's the why read might cause you to consume less fat proportionally. Okay, but that's just one hypothesis that could explain this, right? A causes B. I don't know, maybe it's B causes A, right? Maybe the causal arrow actually points the other way. So, what's the mechanism? Well, maybe it's that people who already consume less fat in their food, right, in their diets, they may be more likely to read nutritional labels in the first place, right? Because that's how they want to maintain the less fat, right? So it's not that reading labels what makes them eat less fat; is they're already eating less fat, and that's what's making them read the labels because they want to maintain their habit, their diet, their lifestyle of eating less fat. Okay, so that's hypothesis number two, right? What's hypothesis number three? Well, some other thing, right? Some other thing here causes them to read and causes them to eat less fat. What could this other thing be? Look, you don't really, I mean, it's of course great to come up with details, right? But you don't have to, at least conceptually, right? Let's conceptually understand that there is this third hypothesis. But, maybe it's personality, right? People who are generally health conscious, they do a lot of things, right? People who are generally health conscious, you know what they do? They exercise a lot, right? They have good sleep hygiene. You know what else they do? They proportionally eat less fat in their food. And you know what else they do? They always look at the nutritional labels on food to make sure they're getting, their full complement of nutrients or whatever. Right. So that's what explains the correlation. They just are both independent effects of some common cause. And that should sound familiar, right? Because that's the right answer to the previous question. So that's the third hypothesis. And of course, the fourth hypothesis is that they're just totally unrelated. Something here causes this, some other thing here causes this, and it's just a big coincidence that they're correlated. And analyzed like this, right, through that frame, you can see this is the same question as the previous question and the one before that. They just jumped right over to a conclusion without considering the other competitive hypotheses. Right? So hopefully this is starting to feel really repetitive, dare I say boring. Right? Certainly it should feel familiar And not just with the two previous questions, because we did a ton of questions like this one when we were doing weaken, strengthen, evaluate. Right? The argument here, in descriptive language now, right? In descriptive language, the argument privileges without warrant one hypothesis when there are other competing plausible hypotheses. Okay, so if you want to use specific language in an answer choice, you could say the reasoning is flawed in that the argument ignores the possibility that now you just pick your hypothesis, right? Here, it ignores the possibility that reading nutritional labels and having lower fat calorie consumption are independent effects of a common cause. Okay, now if I want to use the language of assumes without warrant, I could say the same thing. The reasoning is flawed in that the argument assumes without warrant that reading nutritional labels and proportionally less fat consumption are not independent effects of a common cause. Okay, but as you already know, none of the answers say that. Instead, we have correct answer choice A that says the argument is flawed and that the argument illicitly infers a cause from a correlation. That's it. It's that simple. The argument illicitly infers a cause from a correlation. Yeah, that's the right answer. Why is that the right answer? Well, because step one, it is descriptively accurate. The argument definitely infers a cause from a correlation. Look, this is causal, right? This is a causal verb, and it is inferred from what was simply a correlation. And it is illicit. And this is crucial. Okay, this is crucial because it's not always illicit anytime you infer a cause from a correlation. You can also reasonably infer a cause from a correlation. It's just that this instance was not a reasonable inference. Instead, it was an illicit inference for all the reasons we talked about. You didn't accommodate any of the other hypotheses. Now, when can you infer a cause from a correlation? Well, recall back in the core lessons on causation, you can set up an experiment. If you set up your experiment correctly, then you do get to infer a cause from a correlation. Here, this is obviously not an experiment, so yeah, this is correct. Now, two more things I want to mention before we look at the wrong answers. First is that you'll notice that in the conclusion itself, it didn't actually say promotes consuming less fat calories, right? The way I represented this is kind of a misrepresentation of the actual argument. Rather, the conclusion explicitly says healthful behavior. But that's not the same thing as lower fat calories. They're just different things. So I'm sure a lot of you picked up on that, right? And that's good that you picked up on that because there is an assumption built in, right? The assumption is that eating proportionally less fat calories, right, this thing here, is an example of healthful dietary behavior, right? So it's really good if you caught that assumption because truly this is an assumption. But the problem is that this is not why the argument is flawed. I mean, you can argue the point, right? You can be like, hold on, are we really sure that, proportionally eating less fat calories in diet counts as healthful behavior? Yes, you can have that argument. And yes, you can even say that the argument is a little bit weak for having made such an assumption. It would have been better without this assumption, right? It would have been better if there was evidence to.
Okay, guys, I'm going to take a break and make my breakfast because I've been doing this since like 6:40, so 3 hours, and I'm getting bored, and I don't want to get bored. I want to do it when my head is focused. So I'm gonna take a break, make breakfast, maybe cut out like my RA letters or whatever, and then take out work and then come back to this later on. So I'm gonna log off and start a new live because one, I have to use the restroom, and two, I'm gonna start a new live with like a different title. So people who want to see me make breakfast and help me decide what to eat for breakfast can join that live. So definitely subscribe to the channel because in about 5 minutes, a new live is gonna be started. Help me, guys. You have to join that live because I need your help deciding on what to eat for breakfast today. So I'll see you in a couple of minutes.